Good afternoon, everyone, or good day, if it's not quite afternoon where you're joining from. Thank you for your interest in this webinar by the Africa Policy Research Institute, where we will be trying to answer a question that I think is extremely important. How can we attract investments into the African Continental Free Trade Area, or the AfCFTA? My name is Teniola Tayo, a policy advisor and also the Trade Policy Fellow with APRI. And today I'll be your MC/moderator and really just piloting and guiding us through the discussions. But first, let's talk about APRI. The Africa Policy Research Institute, or APRI, is an independent and non-partisan African think tank. It researches key policy issues affecting African countries and the African continent. APRI aims to provide insights to the German and European Union policymaking process on Africa. In addition, APRI aims to provide policy options to African policymakers and civil society actors. APRI's programs include Economy and Society, which I am under, Africa's Climate Agenda, and Africa's Digital Agenda. Under these programs, APRI designs research projects with its partners and collaborators. APRI's core products built on these programs are policy briefs, commentaries, short analyses, and briefing notes. The discussions in today's event, in fact, relate to a recent article by yours truly on coordinating investments into the AfCFTA. On behalf of APRI, and particularly on behalf of the Trade Policy Workstream, I welcome you all to this event, and I'm really glad that you could join us. Now, some housekeeping. So you're attending this event via our YouTube stream, and the webinar will last for about 90 minutes. It will include a keynote presentation, a panel discussion, and then an interactive session. To ask questions during the interactive session, simply type them in the YouTube chat dialog box, and the questions will be shared with the panel. If possible, you can indicate who your question is directed at. You may also type in general comments in the chat, and we'll make a note of them. The event is being recorded, of course, and will be available on YouTube sometime after the stream. That being said, I'd like to explain the context of this event. I'm sure by now most of us are familiar with the AfCFTA. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a flagship project of the African Union's Agenda 2063 that seeks to create a single African market by removing tariff and non-tariff barriers facing the trade of goods and services in Africa. The AfCFTA seeks to increase intra-African trade, drive industrial growth, and grow prosperity on the continent. Eliminating a majority of the tariffs on goods and services on its own is not enough to significantly increase intra-African trade. Reducing the infamous non-tariff barriers will have a greater impact, provided there are enough made-in-Africa goods to trade. At the moment, a lot of African countries produce and export commodities such as peanuts and a couple of other agricultural goods, copper or crude oil, which is the case with my country, Nigeria. A successful AfCFTA will require African countries to work together much more than they ever have. Most countries have struggled to reach the minimum levels of manufacturing capacity and output that can drive industrialization and structural transformation. But perhaps this can change if they go at it together. This potential is partly the rationale behind developing regional value chains on the continent. Countries with complementary production structures can come together as supply and demand markets for specific input and output towards a final finished product that has a minimum level of complexity. Scaling up production in more complex goods will require both foreign and domestic investment in African economies. These investments will not only bring in much needed capital, but can also help with knowledge and capabilities. But for these investments to come, African economies will need to improve their regulatory environment, identify projects, and promote these projects for investment. Recognizing this, a protocol on investment was included as part of the AfCFTA, and it has been successfully negotiated, although not yet signed and ratified. The investment protocol provides for a Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency that will support AfCFTA state parties with investment promotion. And in some ways, this speaks to a bit of a coordination element as one way to help synergize the process of scaling up production and productivity in African economies. So today we'll be talking about what strategies can be used to coordinate investment promotion in Africa and figuring out what lessons can be drawn from similar initiatives. We have an excellent panel tackling this question, but permit me at this point to invite Roslyn Ngeno from the AfCFTA Secretariat in Accra to deliver a keynote address on behalf of the Secretary General, Wamkele. Roslyn Ngeno is a senior investment expert at the AfCFTA Secretariat. She works for intergovernmental organizations as well as governments, and she has been involved in the development of national and regional investment policies. She has been at the forefront of advocating for and supporting the delivery of initiatives aimed at enhancing private sector-led economic growth and competitiveness through targeted investment, climate reforms, and investment promotion. Thank you so much for joining us, Roslyn, and I yield the mic to you. Roslyn, are you there?
Hello. Am I seen? Am I heard?
We can hear you, but we can't see you yet.
Okay. So, all right, there.
Perfect. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I take this opportunity to thank the organizers very, very much for this session, and particularly for inviting the AfCFTA Secretariat to this webinar. Receive greetings from His Excellency Wamkele, the Secretary General of the AfCFTA Secretariat. I'm now going to read a speech and also make comments around the topic of the day on his behalf. Thank you very much, and welcome to the presentation. The AfCFTA agreement that entered into force in May 2019 is expected to set in motion avenues to grow trade and avenues to improve and increase intra-Africa investment and inter-Africa investment. To address the vision of growing investment to drive and power economic and social development, generation of quality jobs, revenue and productive growth in the local economy, among others, Africa and the rest of the world seeks to increase its capital stock by developing strategies to attract and retain both foreign and domestic direct investment. The fundamental pillars around investment growth and generation that have been seen in the continent and are seen to work are investment attraction, admission, and protection. The continent has experienced and has seen the challenges of fragmented regulatory frameworks governing investment in the region, and there has also been reported and observed governance challenges in the this prompted, yes.
You were ceasing for a bit, but it's all good now.
Okay, it's all good now. I think our network is really unstable, so I'm using devices.
That's okay.
Can you?
Yeah, it's good now.
It's good now. Okay, so let me start on the paragraph. The AfCFTA agreement is made up of the main framework agreement and 3 protocols. The protocols on trade in goods, trade in services, and the rules and procedures on the settlement of disputes. During the negotiation of the negotiators agreed to come up with specifically named protocols in a phase called phase 2 in the following areas: investment, competition policy, and intellectual property rights. In addition, the state parties agreed and anticipated future instruments or protocols that may be deemed necessary within the scope of the agreement. And these are the protocol on digital trade and the protocol on women in trade. So I'm giving a background on the negotiations to the protocol on investment that gives us the facilitation and promotion role within an agency formed under the protocol. Indeed, the positive transformation of African economies is at the heart of the AfCFTA agreement through policies and institutional arrangements that will see increased intra-Africa trade and investment propelled by greater and effective facilitation and competitiveness. May 2021 marked the start of negotiations of the Protocol on Investment, and these negotiations were undertaken within an environment of optimism and expectation, as well as on a reform platform guided by objectives and principles for negotiations established by the member states at the inception of the negotiations. The Protocol on Investment provides an opportunity to adopt an investment regime that advances the objectives of AfCFTA to facilitate investment, promote inclusive growth and development, protect investment, enhance competitiveness of African economies, and ensure the attainment of the broader objectives of the Africa Union Agenda 2063 and the United Nations Agenda 2030. And it is hoped that it will address the challenges that are being seen in the continent of the fragmented regulations and also of the challenges that are observed in governance and promotion and facilitation of investment. Some of the best practices that are seen within the Protocol on Investment include the following. In the preamble, we have the overarching objective of sustainable development. This puts inclusive growth and sustainable development at the heart of the Protocol on Investment, including aspects to promote accountability and responsible business conduct and transparent investment environment. We have the reaffirmation of the right of host states to regulate in the public interest, and this is reflected right from the preamble and gives opportunity to member states to attract and support investments, as well as providing room to address emerging areas or issues of public welfare interest. There are also provisions relating to standards of treatment and protection that have been crafted and drafted with certain levels of safeguards to provide comfort to the investors. We have now the subject of today. We have the area of the innovative chapter on investment promotion and facilitation, and it is aimed at making Africa a preferred investment destination and facilitating quality investments that contribute to sustainable development. We have the salient features around the investment promotion and investment facilitation in the Protocol on Investment, and it makes it a living document and outlines actions the host state should do to ensure that the protocol supports increase of investment flow. It strikes a good balance between the importance of investment and the need to facilitate investments that contribute to sustainable development. And the facilitation component of the provision is tailor-made to specific development needs of Africa states. Now, during the negotiations, member states felt that there was need to come up with a provision that allowed the establishment of an institution that will support and become the voice of Africa promotion and facilitation of investment. To become an institution, to develop an institution that will be used by the state parties to share the investment opportunities available, that will be used by the state parties to identify the strategies that are required to promote investments into the various countries, at the same time positioning Africa as a viable investment destination. So we have the establishment of the institution called the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency. The agency in the provisions is indicated to do the following. The agency shall promote investment within the continent and shall provide technical and other support to member states with a view to branding and positioning Africa as an investment destination, developing and promoting inward investment, designing and implementing frameworks to foster resilient intra-Africa value chains, strengthening investment promotion and facilitation capacities, improving the ability of investors to meet investment regulations, identifying good practices, experiences, and trends in international investment law and policy making, and providing advice on eventual amendments to the protocol on investment. Now, in terms of coming up, the rationale for coming up with this agency has been presented now by the provisions that I've just read out to you. But the crux of this agency is that we need an institutional arrangement that has the competence to speak on behalf of the investment promotion agencies in the continent. It is not speaking for them, but it is speaking on their behalf on promoting their destinations as viable investment destinations. It is presenting a platform where the investment promotion agencies will receive capacity building. Investment promotion agencies will be able to cooperate together when it comes to identifying cross-border investment. And finally, it will support the investment promotion agencies in the continent to seek and identify avenues for revenue or for financial support to our investment agencies to do their work of promoting investment into their various destinations. At the moment, negotiations on the annex on the rules and procedures for the prevention and management and resolution of investment disputes is ongoing, together with the negotiations of the annex on the rules and procedures for the administration and operation of the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency. So in February this year, the heads of state adopted the protocol on investment. And therefore, by that adoption, it essentially established the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency. However, in the establishment, we are yet to have then the rules and procedures to administer, to operate the agency. And this agency, from the provisions negotiated by member states, the secretariat, the AfCFTA secretariat will act on behalf of the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency in discharging its functions until it is fully established. I want to thank you for your attention. So this is just broadly what we have in the protocol on investment concerning the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency. And I am available to then respond a little more on some of the specificities that you may have questions on around this presentation. I thank you very much, and I apologize very much for the internet. It is breaking a lot, and so I don't know whether I've been able to actually deliver appropriately. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Rosalind. I mean, it was breaking up at the beginning, but then it was perfectly clear. So we heard every single word of what you said. It's extremely interesting and fascinating. Thank you for the overview. I was excited to hear that, for example, the agency was proposed by the member states. So this effort at coordination cooperation was actually from the ground up. So in some ways organic, which will help with the political will that is needed to move things forward. I also like that you mentioned the intra-African value chains, which links to a question that I want to ask you, because I saw an earlier draft of this protocol, I think the one from 2021, and the agency was envisioned as a Pan-African investment agency. Then in the more recent draft from this year, there was a reference to the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency, so which in some ways showed the expansion of scope and the efforts towards synergizing, these different objectives, so trade and investment, but working together. And the Secretariat has also done some work in identifying some priority regional value chains under the AfCFTA. So there's a study that I think was produced in collaboration with the UNDP, which is the Futures Africa report, where a number of value chains have been identified in terms of the trade flows that already exist between and within countries, and also the potential trade flows when it comes to input and outputs under specific value chains. So my question is this, the value chains have been identified, I mean, to an extent at the higher level. And then there's the move towards this investment agency, towards this cooperation in attracting investment and facilitating investment. Would you say that both lines of efforts will be working very closely together? So would you agree that with the RVCs, that the next step is to begin to promote investment based on those, those value chains? And would you agree, or what do you think about using that as one model to help to bring countries together, bring state parties together, and help them cooperate instead of competing in the promotion of investment?
Thank you very much for your question. So we have to look at this. The response is looking at it in two ways. The first one is that there is already a strategy in place that has been identified and developed to promote regional value chains in the continent. And this was actually the push now, a lot more came because of the experiences of COVID-19, saying we have our inputs from external, and when external closes their borders, then we are stuck. And yet we can develop our own regional processing into specific value chains, and also even identify those that give high value and utilize the most available resources, and also then ensure that there is a link in more than a couple of countries, so that the benefits are seen. And you said it very well, that
Rosalind? Okay, we lost you just
Hello?
now. You can take the last 30 seconds.
Okay, so I'm saying you said it very well, that we need a situation where we are not we are collaborating. Yes. And because of that, it is then important, it becomes important to identify those critical value chains within the AfCFTA Secretariat. There are 4 priority sectors that have been identified. This is automotive, we have agro processing and value addition, we have logistics, transport and logistics, and then we have the pharmaceutical sector. Those are the ones that have been seen to be able to propel, and they're also seen as able to bring the African countries towards putting the inputs into this regional value chain. The second part is that we need to have institutional support that will then provide the promotion and facilitation. We have the strategies in place through the regional value chains, but how do we then get that investment into the regional value chains, into the regional processing? So we then have this agency, or we have the secretariat, which will be acting as the agency in the interim, that will then work with the countries to promote specifically these value chain areas. So it will mean it will call for this agency, therefore, to start coming up with promotion strategies and facilitation strategies that will tie up the existing strategies that the regional value chain development prioritization has established. So it will be working in collaboration with the institutions dealing with regional value chains, including even because within the secretariat, we have a division that is dealing with regional value chains. And if you look at it, it actually cuts across. When you're talking about goods, you will be talking about an end product of a value chain. So Everything therefore just calls for cooperation and collaboration. But the specific role that the agency will be playing specifically is to collaborate and cooperate with all the, first of all, the investment promotion agencies in the continent, but secondly, with all the institutions that are identifying viable business projects, investable projects. And sometimes even it's the private sector themselves that have these projects, and therefore the institution will support to identify investors for these projects. It will work with development partners, particularly AfCFTA Bank, that is one of the champions of the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency, to provide, to see how then they can provide the support in terms of financing for these viable, bankable projects that will be coming from all corners of the continent. Thank you very much, Tayo. If there's anything else that I can add, I can add on it.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. We lost your video there for a bit, but then I think maybe it helps the audio be a bit more stable. Thank you for that. Again, very interesting insights. I like that you said that, you know, there's already some efforts at promoting the regional value chains from the level of the secretariat, but that the member states or the states parties have to come up with, you know, their own strategies to complement on what is already existing. And then you spoke about the cooperation and the collaboration role that the Secretariat intends to play with this initiative. So perhaps just one other question to you, because I'm aware that there is you have another engagement and interministerial meeting that you have to get to. When you say cooperation and collaboration, it really speaks again to the response of the state parties, of the member states to this initiative. In Nigeria, some years ago, I did some work with the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission, and they did something that was somewhat similar. In this case now, trying to collaborate with and cooperate with the subnational IPAs, so the subnational investment promotion agencies. From your perspective, from your context, and with the aspirations of the Secretariat, what are some of the key things that you need state parties, you need member states, that you need their national IPAs to be doing, and the way that you just need them to respond to this initiative that would more likely guarantee its success? So what do you really need from them, and what would you discourage them from doing?
Okay. The first thing, of course, is the legislation itself. If you know, for the regulation to take effect, it will require the country to adopt and ratify the protocol. That's just the broad number one. But then now, coming to cooperation and collaboration, there are few, in fact, even within the protocol on investment itself, there are provisions that provide the how of the cooperation and collaboration. The first one is the establishment of national focal points. These are focal points that countries establish, state parties establish, to say, if you need information on investment, please, you will need to reach out to this, either this person or this body or this unit. And this unit has the competence to provide all the information that is required, right? And then that national focal point will also be able to provide seamless information to the
Rosanna,
that is the second part. Yeah, I'm here. That is the second. The second part. My internet is really a problem.
Yeah, we'll through.
Yes. So the third aspect is there is a triangular cooperation and collaboration. We have investors who already are asking, you know, where can we invest? I have an investor, for instance, we have an investor who wants to build 200 hotels, but he doesn't want to do it in one country. So you need cooperation in facilitation. And this requires administrative restructuring. So sometimes on the roles, or, on the rules and procedures and processes. So those are the things that that need to be. So you are collaborating on promotion facilitation. So you will need an investor who will go into a number of countries. So it is not one, but you need seamless facilitation. So those are the three that I can say right now, just to manage the internet. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. A lot to unpack. I don't know how long you still be in the webinar for, but I think what we'll do is that even as we proceed with the rest of the panel, some of the key things that come up, we'll reach out to the secretariat again and even engage with you on these ideas, these potential strategies, and some of the learning that it may be possible to do from similar initiatives that have taken place. But thank you so much for your responses. I know there was a question from one of the panelists about how the agency will be financed. But what I heard from you, Rosalind, is that some of those details are still being agreed. So it's down the road that we will really know for sure how it would work out. So now we're going to proceed with the rest of the panel. I'm going to introduce the panelists very quickly. First of all, we have Brian Portelli, and then we have Andrew Thorburn, which will be joining us for the panel discussion. And I think that what's going to happen as well is that we'll be reflecting to some extent on some of the comments that Rosalind has made. So let me introduce Andrew first. Andrew is someone that I consider a friend, if you agree, and that mentored me many years ago when I was a young woman working in investment promotion in Nigeria. Yeah, I mean, youngish. I mean, Andrew works across Africa to support governments set up and run investment promotion agencies. Over the past 15 years, he has advised 15 countries in North and Southern Africa to develop and implement investment promotion strategies, as well as supporting them with advice on removing barriers to investment at a general and at a sector level. So recently, based in Nigeria, he has supported the creation and development of subnational IPAs. Thank you for joining us, Andrew. And then I'll introduce our second panelist, very crucially from the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. We have Brian Portelli, who is the Chief Technical Advisor within the Sustainable Standards and Responsible Business Units in the Directorate of SDG Innovation and Economic Transformation at UNIDO. He currently leads the technical implementation and coordination of the intra-African, Caribbean, and Pacific EU-funded program, supports to business-friendly and inclusive national and regional policies, strengthening productive capabilities and value chains. The program is co-implemented with the World Bank and the International Trade Center. Thank you for joining us today, Brian. We look forward to the discussion, amongst the three of us. Again, to our audience, if you have any questions at any point, you can put them in the chats on the YouTube live stream dialog box. We have someone monitoring the chats, and your questions will be forwarded to the panelists. So perhaps we can start from you, Brian, if that's okay. Can you first of all, in around 5 to 8 minutes, give us a brief overview of UNIDO's work in coordinating investment promotion in Africa? You can share some comments on the AfriPanet, which I know has evolved to the Invest ACP project. And we'd love to hear from you what you think are some of the key insights that the secretariats, that's the AfCFTA secretariats, can pull from UNIDO's work. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. So I hope I won't have similar internet connectivity problems. Thank you very much for this opportunity and for this invitation. Very pleased to participate in this virtual roundtable on such a very important topic. And I will briefly try to provide an overview of the work of UNIDO in investment promotion in Africa. You mentioned AfriPanet. AfriPanet was a program which was launched early 2000, which was running for around 10 years. But from that onwards, from that point onwards, we have evolved in an extensive work being done in primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. So maybe there's no need to say anything about not much about UNIDO, but just to suffice to present a bit of a brief overview. We are a specialized agency of the United Nations, so we assist countries in economic and industrial development. We're headquartered in Vienna, and we have permanent presence in over 60 countries. Our investment promotion work has been evolving from program to program. We are, of course, mainly a technical assistance agency, so we definitely work very close with the investment promotion practitioners, be it the investment promotion agencies, be it the national governments, regional organizations, and of course, the topic of today's discussion is very important for all of us because these are all very important milestone developments that will and are already characterizing what happens in the trade and investment sphere. Briefly, our work specifically rests on two main pillars. On the one hand, we do a lot of work with counterpart investment promotion agencies, supporting them in terms of investment retention and facilitation. Why? Because as much as it's important to bring in new investment and you bring in new fresh capital from abroad, from overseas, it's also very important to look at who has already invested in the countries and what type of experience, what type of impact this investment is having. And of course, this takes us very close to important objectives of the AfCFTA in terms of the sustainability and the endpoints of the economic of investment of economic activity. So how do we do this? I mean, we support IPAs in ensuring that the investment relationship management is brought up to the expected levels by the different counterparts. So maybe I will elaborate a little bit more on this one. There's a second pillar, which of course Roslyn also did some reference to, in the sense that investment promotion agencies needs also to be facilitated to move away from the generic investment promotion to zoom in on what are the the very specific niches or where the opportunities are. So basically, in terms of the formulation of investment projects, formulating investment project in terms of the actual packaging of the investment opportunity, so that this speaks to the potential investors to identify where new investment can and should be challenged. So our experience so far has, of course, unearthed enormous challenges. It, of course, it's not only UNIDO that's facing these challenges, and most importantly, the national stakeholders. But as the AfCFTA experience, of course, it's also providing us with all opportunities, how and in what way can things be improved. So on the investment retention, and this work also links back to the other question that you asked about the experience of AfripaNet. AfripaNet was, as I mentioned, a program that was launched in 2001. It was basically being promoted to bring a little bit of an understanding of what IPAs in Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa should do or should do more and should do better in terms of the facilitation and attraction of new investment. And at that time, the main focus was on the ensuring the adequate empirical evidence, information, data, because of course, without the data, without information, no policy, no real impactful policy can be promulgated. So, AfripaNet was characterized with, let's say, extensive investor surveys in a number of countries. There was the first initiative earlier in the 2000s, basically with only participating 6 or 7 countries, and then it included more and more countries as in further evolves of the program. However, UNIDO then, since UNIDO was developing the partnerships, institutional partnerships with organizations like the World Investment Promotion Agency, WIPA, which also developed an Africa chapter. We agreed that any effort, any developments, any support to African IPAs would be channeled through that platform. Of course, it's very encouraging to hear what are the developments that are coming up on stream from the Continental Free Trade Area perspective. So this is also very important to highlight the needs of IPAs in the continent to work together to, of course, to understand how the common elements of investment promotion can be undertaken. I think I'll stop here, but I guess you will have more questions or clarification points that I'm happy to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Brian. I mean, it's great to hear about how UNIDO is going about things. And I mean, AfriPanet will be an immense resource. I mean, the experience from that really when it comes to working with different African governments and IPAs. And I guess we look forward to even more exchanges between UNIDO and then the AfCFTA Secretariat. And now I'd like to bring in Andrew, first of all, to give your initial remarks. Andrew, your remarks can include your experience working with investment promotion agencies across Africa. I feel like you've been on the ground very much so, and you've been helping them try to attract investments into their economies. So you've been working with governments to establish IPAs, to strengthen IPAs, and to deploy plans for investment promotion and facilitation, and private sector development in general. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Tani. Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to meet you. It's an interesting topic, investment promotion. It's something that everybody wants to do, but most people don't do it very well because it's a complicated business. On the one hand, promoting investments are very detailed work. You can't just go about saying, invest in my country, it's a wonderful place, and don't worry, we'll look after you. You've got to give them a good business reason to do that. And we're talking about data. One of the problems that many states have is they don't have the data. They don't really know their product well enough to document the opportunity in a way that would attract a sophisticated international investor. And of course, if we look at the overall role of an IPA, it's image building, it's promotion and facilitation, very importantly, aftercare, looking after the ones you've got, making sure they stay and expand, and then finally policy advocacy. And I would say that looking at the Pan-Africa Investment and Trade Agency, I think policy advocacy has to be a very big and important role. But if we go back to one thing I wanted to discuss today, really is what are the key success factors for an IPA? Because it seems to me that many governments, they set up IPAs perhaps because somebody says you should have one of these without really understanding what it can do or what it should do and how it needs to be supported and funded. If you set up an IPA as an independent body reporting to the president, that's fine, but someone's got to pay for it. And the president usually doesn't have the money, so it has to come from somewhere. If you set it up reporting to the president's a very busy guy. He probably doesn't have enough time to look after it. And of course, as soon as you're linked to the president, all the other ministries, etc., are competing with you for resources and access. So where do you put the IPA? In this particular instance, the IPA is going to be part of the Secretariat. That sounds absolutely fine. It's going to be part of it's going to have focal points in each African country. That's great. I presume that'll be the national IPAs. Some of these IPAs barely exist. Others are quite strong, but all of the IPAs that I've come across in Africa, and I've worked in Morocco, Algeria, Madagascar, most of East Africa, most of West Africa, they're all underfunded. They don't have the resources. They don't necessarily have the right people. So I think if we're going to make this Pan-African agency work, we have to be very clear that the resources, the mandate, and the strategy all have to be aligned. One of the things that governments quite often forget is that it's all very well to talk about an IPA bringing in lots of investment, but you've got to resource it properly with resources in terms of finance, resources in terms of infrastructure, and resources in terms of the right people. Not necessarily all private sector, but a combination of good private and public sector people with the right experience level and a good understanding of how business works. That's not so easy. It's easy to talk about, not so easy to do. I think the second point is that investment promotion in particular is a medium-term game. You don't suddenly everybody talks about, oh, we're going to set up an agency and we're going to have quick wins. And in quick wins, we're going to have investment flows coming in the first 12 months. That's not the way things work. A good agency, when it's been set up, will probably see its first investors coming in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road. It takes time for companies to make up their minds to invest, and it takes time to build the factory or to do the necessary paperwork to get the investment going. So I think we need to be cautious about how this agency will function, what its real role will be. And until we do that, it's very hard to understand how it can support and help the continent really attract investment. Rosalind mentioned a hotel chain that wants to build 100 hotels in different parts of Africa. That sounds absolutely fantastic. But right now, what is the agency practically going to do? Very difficult to see, because at the end of the day, ECOWAS is going to set up its own IPA. COMESA has its own regional investment agency. And what really does COMESA RIA do? It does some training. It does support its weaker member state agencies. It does help them with strategies. But it doesn't have the resources either to really go out and promote COMESA and to bring it the sort of big investment stories that all of the member states of the African Union would like to see. So it's going to be tricky. I wish it luck. I think it's a really exciting project, but it's going to take time to get up and running. And I just remember the other thing. When we set up, I worked in Morocco, and we set up the Centre Régional d'Investissement, which under a letter from the King in 2006. And we worked in Tangier, Agadir, Casablanca, Marrakesh. We set these agencies up. They were very successful. They were very powerful because they were supported by the regional governors in each of these states. They had no link with the national IPA. In fact, they were probably more effective and more powerful than the state-level IPA. So the balance of power between this transnational IPA, the states, and their own subnational IPAs will be an interesting one to see how it develops. It's going to be challenging. I think it's needed, but I'm just wondering the extent to which investment or trade will be the primary focus when the member states finally sign up to the protocol and to the business plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, very interesting things. So like you said, it's a three-way arrangement between the Continental IPA, which more or less is what the Pan-African Trade and Investment Agency is going to be. And then you have national IPAs. So you have around 54 to 55 national IPAs in Africa, I mean, at different capacity levels. Then you have subnational IPAs. And in some countries, the subnational IPAs are very active. In Nigeria, you have Lagos Invest, and you have a couple of others, Ogun Invest, and many other subnational IPAs that are also doing some work here and there. So how exactly is the synergy going to work? How exactly is the cooperation going to work? But I want to stay on something that you said just before we go back to you, Brian. So some years ago, again, we ran into each other in London at the UK Africa Investment Summit. So at that time, I was just wrapping up my master's, and NIPC being the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission, came to participate in the investment summit with a few of their staff. So at that time, we had a discussion, you and I, about a possible model for investor targeting with African IPAs. So I know we're discussing then, perhaps resourcing a role or two based in London or somewhere in Europe, perhaps renting out one of those co-working spaces, or maybe trying to work with the foreign missions, the embassies present. And then that role would be responsible for going after investors. Again, when we worked with NIPC some years ago, there was something that I was responsible for, which was looking at investment announcements. So this was more like from the FDI markets database, investors have said, oh, we want to do a $200 million worth of investments in Nigeria. But those announcements did not always materialize into actual investment projects. So there was a gap there when it came to investor targeting and investment facilitation. How do you get an investor to go from an announcement to an actual project? And in this case, with the role-based, perhaps in Europe, perhaps another one in the Americas, perhaps one in Asia, where they will be going after the investors that have been identified as relevant to, for example, segments of the regional value chain, that the AfCFTA Secretariat has put together. Do you think such a model may also work for this Pan-African Investment Agency, where, beyond what is present on the continent, they have sort of like liaison agents, running after investors. So the investors don't have to come to Africa before they can be spoken to, but then people are going to meet them where they are and bringing the investment proposition to them in their different offices across the world?
It's a very good question. Okay, but just the point that these offices are expensive. You've got to have good people in them. They've got to be paid local salaries in the country which they reside. They've got to have cars. They're able to travel. They're going to have a big budget. So when we started Check Invest many years ago, we gave them offices all over the world. Each office in those days was 250,000 euros. Now I imagine 30 years later they're a bit more expensive. So you have to bear in mind the budget, assuming that, however, that budgets are not an issue. Yes, I think it's worth having somebody in these areas who can coordinate where they are active, states, local embassies, to bring together the opportunities together. But I think the key issue is always going to be for these representatives: have they got enough detailed information about opportunities, about regional opportunities, to actually go in there and have a meaningful conversation other than just blah, blah, blah? And I think that's the issue. When I worked in Rwanda with the RDB, we used to bring the commercial attaches into the country for a week every year, so we could actually tell them what was going on. They could see what was going on. Well, that's okay, Rwanda and their commercial attaches. Imagine how that's going to work for somebody representing 54 countries. It's going to be tricky. So it's going to have to be something where, if you're going to do that, then you're going to have to use technology to support you. And there's no reason why we can't do proper GIS mapping, proper technology to show investors the opportunity well before they have to get on a plane. But I don't think that most IPAs have got this technology and are using this technology. It's being used in America, it's being used in the UK, it's being used in Europe, but it could be and should be used in Africa. And I think that's a solution to this problem of actually getting the story out there. One, use technology, use webinars, use low-cost but effective marketing tools, but at the same time, give your representatives, or give the investors the opportunity to access really meaningful data that they didn't know and they couldn't find on the internet. Otherwise, tell them something they didn't know, so that they will want to see you, they will want to talk to you, they will want you to help them with their plans. If we can do that, then that's absolutely fantastic. It will work. If we can't, then it's just going to be another cocktail circuit.
Yeah, thank you for that, Andrew. And I think it links directly to what I was going to ask you, Brian, also building from Minido's experience, because some talk about technology and really leveraging on this to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of these efforts, and also trying to reduce the cost of these efforts. But then there's a reality that IPAs in Africa have different capacity levels. So, even when it comes to deploying technology, they have different capacity levels. When it comes to resources, they have different resource levels. So with the experience with AfriPanet and now with Invest ACP, which I am aware has a strong digital component, how have you navigated these varying capacity levels and then making sure that everyone is on the same page, everyone is moving forward at similar, progress rates, and just do you find yourself having to fill in gaps here and there more than from one context to another?
Thank you very much for the question. I think I can safely answer yes to all the questions that you just posed. Yes, indeed. Our current experience in terms of this Invest in ACP program, which is EU funded, which we are, of course, as you mentioned in the introduction, we are implementing in conjunction with the World Bank and the International Trade Center, sees us working very closely with IPAs. And I think it was also quite not so much of a coincidence that this program started also before COVID hit. So basically, there was already an indication that there was a demand, of course, as been discussed and been mentioning in several interventions before me, that there is a need to blend as much as possible the digital and the analog, if you so wish, methods of investment promotion, because there are some economies of scale that could be achieved, that could also be an important tool or set of tools to provide more visibility to countries that so far they are not part of any investment promotion efforts. So it's basically, if the question is whether investment promotion should be more digital or analog, I guess the answer here is that it has to be a complement between the two. Of course, as Andrew rightly pointed out, the main essence is not so much about these tools and how these tools are being used, but essentially what is the message, what is the content that is being promoted. Because that's why I also made reference earlier on about the need to move away from the generic towards the more specific. We're also working on business diplomacy ourselves. We have also, last September, we launched a digital investment promotion platform with the idea to showcase the work that's being done at the ground level, identifying the investment opportunities that are within the sectors that are being promoted. So time and time again, there are these events where sectors are being promoted for investment, but basically there's nothing more else being said to the investors, to the potential investors, that they don't know already, or maybe their consultants are not aware of. So here the idea is basically to work with these agencies, but also with other institutions that are working more in the SME field, working with local enterprises, because the trade and investment nexus is a very important one, especially from a Pan-African perspective. Supporting outward investment, maybe create the multinationals of tomorrow that can invest from one African country to another, basically starting from trade, but then moving on more direct investment. So the idea of this platform is basically to give more visibility to these investment opportunities that have been adequately packaged and researched, to the extent that when the investor is asking for more details, at least the investment promotion agencies or those who are working on their behalf are able to partake in a meaningful discussion. I agree, of course, with the comments made that this is not, of course, an exercise that happens within one day or two, and basically investment is sealed over a couple of days from when the first contact is made. But it's already let's say a step forward to make sure that the visibility aspect is then complemented by content. And I think this is very much the main challenge that we are also facing ourselves. And of course, this is very much a relative of lack of resources, lack of also networking within the countries, within the regions, whereby IPAs themselves are kind of trying to do it all alone, without too much resources, without not too many linkages with other institutions, perhaps, that are vying for the same investment. And there is also a question of a need for consolidation. So I think when the objective and when the vision is so extensive as that dictated by a Pan-African vision, I guess one of the first things that need to happen at the national level, at least, is there has to be some sort of consolidation of effort, whereby institutions like IPAs have to be provided with the right resources, but nonetheless, they are also at an important vantage point of trying to work with other institutions where there are initial indications of where investment needs to be mobilized. And I think this is also another way to take it forward like that. Yes.
And I think, Brian, we have to remember that our IPAs are competing with each other. So, you know, it's all very well to say we're all going to work together and it's going to be a happy family. But why would they, how happy is it going to be? Some of these IPAs are fighting each other for a particular mobile investment. It's not all resource driven. A lot of this mobile and the targets that we're talking about, automotive, pharma, logistics, are all mobile investment opportunities. They can go to this country or they can go to that country. There are so many countries that need all of this. We're not talking about mining companies. We're not talking about just energy opportunities. We're talking about places where cost and infrastructure and skills are similar in many countries. Africa has one of its problems is that many countries do the same thing in Africa. And until that differentiation it becomes more apparent, people are going to be competing. So do you go to Kenya, Uganda, or Tanzania, for example? They all have wonderful opportunities. You might say, well, Kenya is stronger in this area, but perhaps Tanzania has strengths in other areas. But that nuance has to be, on the one hand, brought out, on the other hand, managed by a Pan-African IPA, because they can't be seen to be taking sides.
Yeah, and Andrew, I think that's even the idea behind the regional value chains, you know, based investment promotion. Because now, instead of everyone trying to get investors to come and set up car assembly or manufacturing plants, you know, they're focusing on specialized sectors of the value chain. So perhaps someone wants to build capacity in building windscreens, I don't know how, or windshields, I don't know how possible that is. Or someone wants to build capacity in building parts of the engine. But there's a question I wanted to ask Brian, actually, staying on this point of cooperation and some of the challenges. So there was a question in the chat on YouTube about some of the stumbling blocks to cooperation among IPAs in Africa. And when Rosalind was speaking, she spoke about having focal points. You know, when we asked her, what do you want from national IPAs? She said, oh, you know, as part of the provisions in the protocol, there's a requirement to have focal points from each country that can make it easier, you know, for them to work with the country. So they are not randomly trying to reach out to the executive secretary or the CEO, but then there's someone that knows that they're part of this network and that can very quickly make information available to them. It's even also links to the idea of going after investors, right? The more analog approach of going after investors physically, because for you to do that on behalf of a continent, you also need to know that you can very quickly reach the focal points in the member states, in the national IP, that can get information to you as quickly as you need it. So the question is in two parts. First of all, some of the stumbling blocks to cooperation, you know, from what you've seen, from where you're sitting, but also, what do you think should be the profile of such a person? So the focal points within national IPAs, what do you think should be their profile, you know, perhaps education or just experience levels that you think may make it easier for them to cooperate amongst each other? It could even be someone that is more Pan-African. I don't know if that comes into play, where they see the bigger picture versus reverting to a more competition-based approach like Andrew is alluding to. So over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much. I think I would answer your question by making a premise that I would make a distinction between cooperation that has to happen within the countries. And so, of course, that's what I'm more referring to as cooperation between institutions who are expected to make the difference to the existing investors, but also to the new potential investors. So I'm talking about IPAs that, of course, have a trust issue with the existing investment community. They need to solve problems. They need to improve the business environment. They cannot do it alone. They need to work with utility firms. They need to work with other ministries, etc. So that's the understanding, of course, from a cooperation that has to happen within host countries. Then at the regional level, yes, I guess it's all very nice to think about equipping these regional undertakings with focal points, etc. But the key point here is that there has to be, of course, a very strong reference to the overarching vision that needs to be achieved here, in the sense that yes, enabling cross-border intra-regional investment is an important goal. Of course, vision is one thing. We need also to equip that with important in-depth studies of what is feasible or not feasible, because there might be some investment which touches more than just one country at a time along different stages of a value chain. That makes sense, that can be presented as a feasible, bankable investment opportunity. But yes, I agree that we also find a situation where you have many countries essentially being for the same investment. And of course, it's very hard to think that all of a sudden all these countries will start cooperating to basically compete with each other to push one another off the pedestal. So I think in addition to the very important political message that should be there, it's very important also to act on the basis of adequate studies and real feasibility of what is bankable from a perspective of which value chains work, which transcend certain boundaries, certain cross-border investment that can facilitate, can support the economic situation in particular areas which are going to be touched by the investment. It's only like this because otherwise we will keep on perpetuating this. And let's also face it that this is not a problem that only the African continent has, because a regional investment promotion initiatives all look fantastic on paper, but the crux is when they are when you start to implement, because there are, of course, very important similarities in terms of economic structure, in terms of what type of investment is being targeted. But there are still those niches. I believe there are still those niches that, in fact, investment can and should be encouraged. But of course, this requires a lot of emphasis on analysis, on studies, on feasibility assessment. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
agree.
And
Kenny, can I just make a
no, I'm coming to you just now. So actually you can make it when I ask a question. So I want you to address a couple of things. Michael Clemens asked a question about IPAs having a transparent and published set of KPIs and performance measures. So it'll be good if you can address it also in the webinar and then add the points that you wanted to add just now.
Okay, so yeah, Michael, good to see you. Very rarely do IPAs publish their targets. Most professional IPAs publish their results. They will probably have targets. They will have to discuss their targets with their funding bodies, but they don't usually publish their targets in advance for very good reasons. There are so many externalities in terms of, imagine if you had published an ambitious set of targets based on trends up to 2018, and then what happens? 2019, 2020, you have COVID, and all of a sudden, boom, your targets go out the window. So. But Rwanda is a good example where they do measure and publish their targets very well. One or two of the state-level IPAs in Nigeria do have targets, quite ambitious targets. They do publish those targets, at least to their board and MDAs, because they understand that they can't do it alone. They have to bring in the MDAs to help them achieve those targets. So it's rare. Most IPAs don't create targets, but And that's a shame, because they should. It's good business practice to do so. And it would help everybody if they understood there's a relationship between resources, strategies, and achievement of results, which sometimes seems to be forgotten. What I just wanted to say was, I wonder what the role of our new Pan-African IPA would be in supporting Africa investment. I've been involved recently over the past 2 years in an AFDB funded project in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and the Gambia. And one of our tasks has been to take missions to visit investors in outside their countries. And they've tried to go to the US, they've tried to go to Europe, and they've tried to go to Africa, other African countries. And what we found was the most successful by far investment missions they did was all coming to Nigeria. Not going to America. Americans, these small little countries, no good, too small. Europeans are timid about Africa at the best of times. But Nigerians and other African investors understand exactly what the opportunities are and can exploit them. And I think one of the things that perhaps this agency can do is to promote much more clearly and much more effectively Africa investment. I think it would be a good thing for all countries involved, and it would perhaps raise the skills of all of the IPAs as well.
Thank you for that, Andrew. It's very important because actually the investment protocol is looking more at intra-African investments. So because, you know, the AfCFTA is about intra-African trade, and then the investment protocol is about intra-African investment and harmonizing the regulatory environments to allow for that. But then the idea was that, okay, if we're improving the regulatory environment for intra-African investment, then it would also benefit inter-African investment, as Rosalind mentioned earlier. But it's a super important point because African investors already, to some extent, know how to navigate the continent, right? So it's always a question of domestic investment, foreign investment. It's not either or. It's really about, you know, trying to work to bring both of them in as much as possible. There is this popular quote that I find funny, that capital is cowardly. I don't know to what extent the panelists agree with that, but the capital is cowardly. But when you have capital that perhaps is a bit more familiar with the context, then perhaps it may be a bit less cowardly. I mean, look at a Dangote that has gone to invest so much money and debts into a refinery in Nigeria, something that many other people may not even touch. So it's his connection with the local context that is allowing him to make that decision that may not seem as rational as you'd expect. So I think I'll ask one more question to the both of you. There's some other comments that we've gotten in the chat. You have Amilcar recognizing the statements that a lot of governments establish IPAs without exactly understanding how they're supposed to work, which I think brings us to something that has come up, you know, a couple of times in this conversation, which is about financing and resourcing the IPAs. I know we've heard from Andrew a little bit on that. I mean, Rosalind also mentioned it a bit in her statement, but it'll be good to hear from you, Brian. So from this overarching perspective, you mentioned WIPA, and of course from AfriPanet to Invest ACP. What have you observed have been the better approaches to financing IPAs and making sure that their efforts are sustainable?
Thank you. Yes, and you mentioned WIPA because it's actually interesting. I mean, we've just concluded a survey among ACP IPAs to understand how they, of course, have been trying to develop their forays in the more use of digitalization to support investment promotion. And one of the kind of area questions, which of course is something that we are experience directly when we work with IPAs, is that yes, in the let's say with the assumption that resources are going to rise to increase year after year, because of course the budgets are actually being cut rather than added, that of course there's an interesting look at how perhaps to harness some elements of digital tools to support the more efficient, more effective kind of process improvement that can be had with small incremental ways of how to do things. And that's why taking us back to the question that we exchanged earlier on the should it be more digital or should it be more analog? So of course, the understanding there is that there is already some indications that some incremental use of digital tools can, of course, make you do more, better, and much cheaper over the longer term. So I think this will be something that we ourselves are looking forward to continue working with our counterparts in this area, when it comes to investment monitoring, in terms of investment aftercare support. Then there's no need to have face-to-face all the time. There's also a need to have continuous information and data coming in from the existing investors, but it's a process. But on the other hand, I think the main point about the resourcing is that, of course, in the context that trying to do the best with what you have, there are still, of course, lopsided allocations in terms of less and less is being put on taking care of who's already in the country, employing people, and is on the verge of deciding to move away. So less is spent on investment retention services, and more, of course, is spent aimlessly and blindfoldedly in terms of investment promotion, which is more of a generic nature, which may or may not yield important results. So I think the idea is, of course, that if there is limited and scarce resources, the best thing that you need to do is to use it very, very conservatively and very effectively. And then, of course, to try to understand whether resources could also be rechanneled to best impactful use, to take care of existing investors, but also to make sure that if there's investment promotion, yes, why not attending events abroad? Why not harness digital tools? But the important thing is to make sure that there is more content to be shared with prospective investors. Because then again, a lot of money is spent on projects that may be technical assistance projects that might find organizations like UNIDO participating in providing the technical assistance. Other resources might be used to engage consultancies, etc., to do similar or related work. But if the ultimate goal is to provide more impetus for new investment, there is, of course, a need to make some changes in the way how things are undertaken, also from a content perspective. So it's useless to present a more of a generic way of please come invest here because we want the best for this investment, etc., without going into the detail, the nitty-gritties of where this investment should take place. Thank you.
And I think that raises the question: is okay, how you have a project that could go
Thank
to
you,
South
Brian.
Africa,
Something very key, that really facts. Yeah. I was speaking. Is my connection good? Can you hear me?
Your connection's okay now, yeah.
Okay, yes. I was just following up on what Brian said. A key point where you said more resources are being expended on investment promotion as opposed to investment retention, and then you need to make sure that the balance is better there, because I mean, you can't spend all of your resources promoting investment and then the investment doesn't come in and doesn't stay. So that was a very key point. I was actually going to come to you, Andrew, before you interrupted. Just on the same issue of financing IPAs, I think you have some ideas on how the Pan-African agency might go about things based on your experience. So perhaps you can share some of your thoughts on what you think could be some strategies to be deployed in this area.
Well, clearly, if it's going to be effective and useful to the states of Africa, then the African states should pay for it. Now, since most states won't even pay for their own IPAs, that's going to be a challenge. So that leaves you back to donor funding. You might get donor funding for a few years, but does that raise unexpected or unreasonable expectations as to future revenue streams? Probably it does. One of the opportunities in the protocol was to talk about actually earning money. So how is this IPA going to earn money? Is that through deal fees? Is it through consulting fees? Is it going to crowd out the private sector if it does that? How does the agency earn money? I don't know of any IPA in the world that earns 100% of its costs, covers 100% of its costs. CINDE is always, from Costa Rica, is always quoted as one of the big examples where they do over 50% of their funding is provided by non-government sources. When I used to work in the Scottish Development Agency, I think we got up to about 35%. But we had a land bank, we did property development, we had a venture capital fund, and with a good level of IRR. So that's another opportunity, but that's well beyond the scope of this particular agency. Zimtrade in Zimbabwe is funded by the private sector. It doesn't get any government money. It's funded 100% by the private sector because Zimtrade does what it says. It promotes trade effectively and is very good value for money. If this IPA can be seen as being good value for money, I suspect that there are many potential organizations who would support its funding. In the Czech Republic, when I worked there, we set up Czech Invest. We had something called basically the Friends of Czech Invest, and they had special privileges in being introduced to investors as they approached Czech Invest, and they got fees for doing that, and we got fees for introducing them in the first place. So that's another way of doing it. But at the end, investment promotion is a public good, and I think it needs to be paid for by the public purse.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds nice to say, but I'm speaking from Nigeria, and I know that the public purse is very small and very tight. But you're right. I mean, we need to find more sustainable ways of doing these things, because what happens is that these IPAs become very dependent on donor funding and donor projects, and this is not sustainable. The projects start and then they end after a couple of years, and some of that capacity that was being put in the IPA leaves. Sometimes there's some retention of the abilities and capabilities, but sometimes you have a loss of those abilities and capabilities. So before we go to final comments, I saw
one question,
there's another comment that was in the chat.
Comment from Michael
Right,
Clemens is saying, basically Michael Clemens is saying he thinks they should be self-funding, they should charge for their services. I think it's a nice idea, but tricky.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, this idea of killing or eating what you kill, to what extent can it really play out in this case? And yeah, I mean, I was going to share another comment that was in the chats from the YouTube. So it's the question of the fact that perhaps one way to drive efficiency is for these IPAs to work with their diplomatic missions abroad. This is what ought to be happening already, and I'm sure it's happening in various spaces to different extents, but perhaps it's one thing that has to be improved, and perhaps it's one thing that can also be included in the provisions with the Pan-African Investment Protocol. So with the Investment Protocol, just this objective and initiative to increase the cooperation and collaboration between the national governments, national IPs, but also their diplomatic missions that are already there in those countries, that understand the countries to an extent, and that's, find it easier to even reach out to local investors in the different spaces that they operate. So we have about 7 more minutes on the clock. You don't think, I mean, Andrew, you and I debate a lot, so we'll try not to debate too much on this panel. But then if I can get some final statements from the panelists, starting with Brian, just some key takeaways that you would like the Pan-African initiative to go with. I mean, like I said, this is the first of a series of engagements, of exchanges towards really actualizing this project, and just towards making sure that it achieves the aims that it has set out to achieve. Right. So if you have perhaps 3 key takeaways from your work and even from the conversation that you would like the agency or even the general initiative to take on board?
Thank you. Yes, I think my take for the 3 points would be don't lose sight of the business environment needs, because of course it should not be a top-down approach, but very much a bottom-up consideration of what's the existing business environment that should facilitate the consolidation of existing investment, but also should pave the way for new investment to come in, because it's useless to think about turning over a new leaf and basically attract new investment if there are unresolved issues within the business environment. And of course, if we're talking then about the Pan-African business environment, that's of course quite a hefty discussion that needs to be tabled, and I'm sure is being related to the discussions at the investment on the trade and investment nexus level. My second point is definitely yes, the amalgamation of more resources, but more careful use of resources, but at the same time also to make sure that from a content point of view, what prospective new investors are looking for is content, detailed information. And I think this is also something that should not be continue to be overlooked, because that's how one can distinguish the old way of doing investment promotion towards a new way of being a bit more of a targeted approach of being maybe more efficient with resources that are vested within these organizations to do their job. It is also a question of trust building, and again here the issue is about the trust building between the investors and the agencies. So one would assume that trust would also be reflected within a context of a Pan-African intervention. So trust between what the new agency, or let's say the new institutional setup would seek, not only to promulgate new ways of attracting investment to the continent, but also to make sure that this is linked to other ongoing initiatives like more trade between the countries, but also how they are, for example, supporting local enterprises, supporting domestic SMEs, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Brian. So you said 3 things. First of all, don't lose sight of the business environment needs. And like you said, this is even more complicated on the African level. I mean, it's many different economies, many different dynamics that you're trying to really manage. But it's absolutely one of the objectives of the investment protocol, really about addressing this business and regulatory environment and improving it. Then you said to make the allocation of resources more efficient, really. So just to make sure that you can, in some ways, do more with less. And then you mentioned trust building between the different stakeholders, which I think is very key, because you don't want a situation where something is initiated perhaps at the continental level, and then someone at the national level decides to go behind, and do something else. Yeah, it's a good point to bring on board. So over to you now, Andrew. Also 3 points that you think you'd like to leave us with on this topic. Again, an ongoing conversation, but yeah, what would you like to share with us in closing?
I take Brian's point about trust. I think it's absolutely fundamental that this agency generate trust from 2 particular audiences. First, the states that it represents. It's got to have so if an investor is looking at South Africa or Nigeria, how does it play the honest broker without breaking the trust that both countries should have in the agency? So trust is very important. Secondly, information. There is probably no good single source of data about investment regulations, about investment, and about investment opportunities across the continent. So it may well be that one of the first things they should do is to create a useful information resource that will drive people to it. And that will enable it to establish dialogue. And also, with the information about that is available, let's also have a market intelligence service that it can provide to its member states. So immediately it becomes a useful partner with the states. So FDI markets has signals. I don't think it's particularly effective, but something along those lines could be useful. And the third thing is let's use the resources of this, hopefully meaningful resources of this agency to support the small countries, the small and underfunded countries. I can see where it'd be too easy to just go after the big countries, just go after the powerful countries and forget the small countries. It has to have an even hand. It has to identify opportunities, not just for the big boys, but for the small ones as well. And that will be tricky, but I think that's an important function of a Pan-African agency.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I mean, very crucial points as well. I think the information bit of it, Nido is doing some work in trying to put that together, and I guess that can be accelerated as well. This has been a brilliant panel for me, and I think for everyone that has been following it. There was one other question, but we are out of time. So again, an ongoing conversation that we will continue to follow. To everyone watching, again, this is the African Policy Research Institute, our webinar on investments in the AfCFTA. I had with me Rosalind Ngeno from the AfCFTA Secretariat. She had to step away for another meeting. And then Brian Portelli from UNIDO and Andrew Thorburn from Thorburn and Associates, if I said that right. It's been a fascinating conversation. This will feed into some research done by APRI. The link to APRI's website is going to be shared in the YouTube chat, as well as a link to some of our publications on the topic of the AfCFTA, but also on the topic of investment promotion under the AfCFTA. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you.